to this special edition of Fatima TV Worldwide. I'm John Vennari, and here we are at the Fatima Your Last Chance Conference in Rome. We're interviewing the various speakers who are with us at this conference, and today we're going to bring out Michal Semin from Prague. He's the head of the St. Joseph Institute, a traditional Catholic, and does a lot of work in homeschooling and other areas of Catholic life. So please, Mr. Semin. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, John.
Pleasure to meet you.
I'm not sure if it works.
Yes, it works.
Oh,
yes.
Good.
So you're from the Czech Republic, and I guess the springboard connection to Fatima, of course, is Our Lady said that if her requests were not met, Russia would spread her errors throughout the world. Many of us, I'm from the United States. This is an English edition program here. There'll also be in Italian, but most Americans or Canadians or English-speaking people or Italians didn't actually live under communism. But in Czechoslovakia, you did.
Yes.
And so we'll start talking about what life was like under communism, and we'll start where you want. Where do you want to start with?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was born in 1967. That was just in the middle of the of the communist era in the former Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a state that doesn't exist anymore. Today we have the Czech Republic and Slovakia. These are two independent states. But in the time of my birth, it was called Czechoslovakia, and the communists took over the power there in 1948. So if we believe the story that communism ended in 1989, 1990, we might talk about this later if it's true or not, then I was born just in the middle of it. So, and communism had various manifestations during its presence in Czechoslovakia. The most brutal persecution came in the first years.
Say the first
after
what?
1948.
First 10 years?
Let's say the first 10 years, yes.
And that was just to really subdue the public?
Yeah, a little bit of easing was after Khrushchev's death in 1956. There was a little bit of easing. Then in the 60s, there also was a kind of not many people were jailed at that time. Then 1968, which might be known also to the American audience, that's the year of Soviet occupation with the other armies of the Warsaw Pact, because some of the communists in Czechoslovakia were considered by the powers in Moscow to becoming too independent from their control. And then the 70s, 80s era called normalization, and then the so-called end of communism. Communism in Czechoslovakia was to a certain degree different from other Central Eastern European countries, or from countries in Asia or Africa or Cuba or elsewhere where communism
So does communism come in and try to somewhat adapt itself to the national character?
Yes, and,
a
little bit.
Living under communism in Czechoslovakia was different from those living under communism in Russia, correct?
Yes, correct. And the reason is that Russia mainly was in a much poorer condition than Czechoslovakia, which was considered the industrial heart of Europe, with a long tradition of education and intellectual tradition and so forth. Russia mainly was a country full of peasants in the moment when communism was installed there, and for a reason, because they didn't expect too much opposition from the powers. Besides the Orthodox Church, there was not a single power that would be able to oppose the Bolshevik Revolution. So yes, again, Poland is a different case, completely different case, because of its Catholic heritage, which was much stronger than in Czechoslovakia, especially the Czech lands, the western part of Czechoslovakia, which underwent in its, let's say, late medieval ages, a vast Protestant revolution. I'm not sure if all of you know the name of Jan Hus, or John Huss.
John Huss, yes.
Who would be sort of a front runner for Martin Luther and the German Reformation or Protestant revolt in the 16th century. So there was a strong Protestant tradition in the Czech lands, contrary to Poland, where Poland was more Catholic. So during the communist era, the Catholic Church remained much stronger than in Poland than in Czechoslovakia.
We tend to, especially in the West, we tend to view communism as something that restricts freedom, that restricts private property, people owning their own properties. How did that play itself out in Czechoslovakia, as far as freedoms, as far as people owning their own farms and means of production?
Correct, yeah. Well, everything, the whole public life as such just disappeared. There was nothing, there was no freedom left for the public sphere. The government, the state, took control of everything. I mean, the sphere for privacy was limited really just to the everyday dealings typical for a family life, you know, waking up and getting ready to go to the work and then going back and watching television. That was the ordinary life of people under communism. They couldn't express any of their views or their opinions in public other than just those that were the party line, precisely. My memories from, let's say, my teenage years was that the life under communism was completely shallow. There was a total emptiness, a dumbness, hypocrisy. There was, as I said, the public sphere didn't exist. There was a wall of separation between private life and public life, which had a damaging impact on most of the people living there, because there were certain things that people would say to each other if they trusted each other in private, but they would never say it in public because they were afraid to lose the job or could be even imprisoned if it was considered to be, subversive of the regime and so forth. So this really kept many people in a kind of schizophrenic mentality, which obviously for the integrity of the human person is very unhealthy.
So what about the type of education you would have received under, was it a state, the party line education?
Sure, yeah. All private types of schooling was forbidden. So private schools, religious schools, church schools, obviously any kind of home education, homeschooling that would be official or legal, that was just impossible. I mean, home education was going on, obviously, in those families that were trying to correct the errors of the school. So the children came back home from the school and then were educated by their parents. But so the whole school system was nationalized. Everything was under government control, and for a reason, because the school became the most efficient tool for the communists to separate the children from the authority of their parents. And that was their main aim, definitely not to educate, but to indoctrinize the children with the communist ideology.
Such as?
Such as abolition of private property.
That this is a good thing.
That this is a good thing, yeah.
The government is your best friend.
The government is that's right. And then atheism. Atheism was a fundamental principle of a communist school. So anything that smacked of religion was ridiculed. And children that would come from Catholic schools, they would be somehow sidetracked. Some of the teachers would would bully them or put them on stage and the other children will laugh and so forth. If the worst type of teacher would be someone who would even tell the children to spy on their own parents. There was this famous story of Pavel Morozov in the Soviet Union, who was given a kind of a prize for. He became a hero of the communist youth because he got his own parents into prison.
I see we have a question from the audience already.
Oh.
So, yes.
Mr. Semin,
yes.
your remarks reminded me that a man from Croatia who often gives talks about living under communism said that parents would not even talk about their views in front of their children for fear that a remark might be said on the playground that might bring persecution into the home. Did you ever learn about your parents' true feelings?
That's a very good question. You're right. The parents, many parents didn't talk in front of their children about their private opinions because they were afraid that if the children would say in front of the teacher in the school,
even innocently.
Yeah. My mom or daddy said this yesterday, then mom or daddy would get into serious trouble. And there were exceptions. Fortunately, my parents were among those who we talked openly about various issues at home. Although I was not raised in a Catholic family. I'm a convert, so my parents didn't teach me anything regarding faith. But on the natural level, my parents were strongly anti-communist. So, but they always told me what I should keep for myself and what I should tell the comrade teacher. Yeah.
Thank you.
So now, what about industry and commerce under communism?
Again, everything nationalized, all the agriculture. So all the small farmers, families in the countryside that they just had to give it to the government. Those who opposed or put some obstacles or the property they were expropriated, and many of them were imprisoned for their opposition. Many of them died. Usually those without faith, there were many people who lost everything and committed suicide. So, especially in the 50s, speaking about Czechoslovakia.
Well, we tend to think of Russia with you talk about going to jail. And in Russia, of course, there'd be very harsh jails. There would be beatings and tortures and things like that. Was that type of thing going on in Czechoslovakia?
Yes, also. Yeah. We during it always depended. I was in prison only for a short period of time, but was interrogated many times. And I don't know how it's going in other regimes, but I always had two men. One would be relatively nice to you, he would try to make you talking, and and the other one was the bad guy. He was the one who was making the threats. And so my very first interrogation, this nice guy, he invited me to play, how do you call it in English? Darts, yes. Play darts, and we can have a discussion during that. I said, no. Fortunately, I was prepared for that situation because I underwent a training how to behave during interrogations. And the second one started to threaten when he understood that I am not going, easily following the line of the nice one. So the bad guy started to threaten with throwing my father from the work he was doing, from his profession, and not letting my sister to enter high school. So
now, how real are those threats? I mean,
they were real.
Yeah. Okay.
They really were trying to,
Break you down.
break you down, yeah. It didn't, well, I just never agreed to talk to them. And they
So-
never really fulfilled the
Yeah,
threat,
that's what I was
in
gonna
my
ask.
case, in
Yes.
my case. But there were other cases where they really went after the relatives, which is the worst thing. You know, you
Yes.
can bear something
Yes.
if it's just you alone. Maybe even for that reason, among the most courageous men were some of the priests. You know, living a celibate life, they really take care just about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But the regime, broke many fathers because they were
They would
thinking
threaten the
about
children.
threatening the children,
Yes.
you know, your wife or your relatives.
So you're describing a system then where you're living under constant a kind of surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
You have no means of your own production. You're just a serf for the state. You are afraid of just being whisked away to jail for the most flimsiest of reasons, and you have no recourse to any sort of jury or justice. So what does this do then to the population at large? What is the general sentiment of the country, of all the people living under that type of oppression?
Right. Well, the general sentiment, or the majority, would just become, to a certain extent, cynical. They would lose any sense of higher meaning of life. I'm talking about the majority, not about everyone.
Sure. Yeah.
On the other hand, you would find, because of this oppression, because of the persecution, a growth among those who would fight back. And this would be usually religiously motivated. Not exclusively, but... So that's why they never really succeeded, even if they tried to really suppress the church in such a manner that it would be impossible to live, let's say, a relatively, well, not a free religious life, because the religious life was restricted only to the like assisting at the mass or something like that.
So they didn't
only inside the churches.
Yeah.
You couldn't publish anything. You couldn't teach religion in the school or doing anything in the public.
So then how did the Catholic Church survive during this? It went underground. And
Yeah, part of
what
the
were those
church went
activities?
underground. Part of the church went underground. Well, a good number of priests and bishops and most religious orders ended in concentration camps. So in the early ages, in the first years after 1948, all.
Now, where were these camps? In Russia, or they were in?
No.
Czech?
They were in Czech. Yeah,
They were in Czech.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. They, except one, who even accepted. No, he wasn't a bishop. He was merely a priest, but he became a member of the communist government, and actively persecuted his brothers, priest brothers. Incredible story, but all the bishops were put into. They didn't call it concentration camps. It was like detention camps. They turned the monasteries into detention camps. So all the religious orders were forbidden to exist, and the male monasteries were turned into these detention camps. Many priests died during their imprisonment, and those who didn't either entered or were active in the underground church, or were part of the so-called official church, recognized by the government, because they acted on the principle that they had to accept a certain certificate from the government, that they are allowed a license, yeah,
Yes.
a priestly license, and they were monitored on a regular basis. They had to send reports. What are they doing, and how many people are coming are going to the church and so forth.
Well, I guess we could leap ahead to the great glasnost, perestroika, the great awakening, and what from your perspective, what do you say about what the world calls the end of communism? What do you see really happened in 1988, 89?
Right. Well, my current views differ from the views I had in 1989. I obviously celebrated immensely the changes for a simple reason, because I was in prison in 1989, and I left the jail. And later, in January or February 1990, I discovered a friend of mine who became working at the Ministry of Interior, got papers into his hands, and I was on a list of people that should have been exemplarily sentenced for a good number of years. So, merely for personal reasons, I was happy about the changes. And I thought they are genuine. And I thought the West, the democratic West, won, and communism is destroyed and will never return again. Because frankly, I mean, people living under communism would never vote communism back again. Because in the time I was living, contrary to the first years of communism, when there really were believers in the ideology, I do not recollect anyone who would really love it or believe in the faith system of communism.
I'm told by friends in Poland too that most of the Polish communist government didn't believe in communism.
Sure enough, yeah.
It was
yeah.
They were looking out for number one.
Yeah.
They were looking out for themselves, and they went along with this.
Yeah. So it was only during this transition period from communism to the so-called free society that I started to have doubts about. Well, the first reason was that many of the communists that were persecuting us became the first capitalists. They had enough money to invest in the privatization process that was being in process, and eventually they became preaching democratic capitalism. The same people that would go to the Communist Party congresses and vote for our persecution.
Well, what's interesting too is we know that after, we'll say it was due to the war, but after Nazism collapsed, there was the Nuremberg trials. There were these jailers and these government officials who perpetuated these terrors on innocent people were actually brought to trial and convicted. But in communism, that didn't happen.
No.
None of these criminals, none of these monsters were ever brought to any sort of justice, nor was it even talked about.
Precisely.
For what I recall.
Precisely. And the attempts to punish, at least symbolically, were opposed not by the population of these countries, but by European Union. And by mainly the left in the Western European countries that became defending publicly the old communist establishment. And I'm not talking about a real retribution. This would be just, for example, there was a law in Czechoslovakia and at the beginning of 90s disallowing or forbidding the former agents of the secret police to hold certain government positions. That's it. I mean, no imprisonment, no, they could invest all their...
They could still own a corporation.
Yeah, sure, precisely, which many of them did.
Buy a fleet of jets and all of that. Good
and so that's it. Only that they are restricted in a sense that they are not trustworthy to run the country, and that's it. And there was an outcry of protest
from the people.
from the West.
Oh, from the West.
Oh,
okay.
From the West, not from the people. And there was no one except those who were affected by it who would oppose it. But it came from the West, a threat that if you are going to punish the communists, then will not be on good terms. And so many people started to think, well, what's behind this? I mean,
Right.
we suppose that these are two powers at war. I mean, this is the powers of evil and powers of good. Or
Yes.
what was the famous phrase of President Reagan?
The axis of evil.
No. This is Bush. But
That's Bush.
Reagan said the empire of evil or something like that.
Yeah,
about
yeah,
the
yeah.
Soviet
Evil
Union,
empire, yes.
evil empire.
Yes, yes.
And these were the forces of good. So we, and now we see that the West, which supposedly won the Cold War, is defending their own... protecting their former enemies. So, that raised some doubts in not just my mind, but...
We have only a little bit of time left, but we had spoken earlier, well, we only have 2 minutes, but the fact that communism is still there culturally.
Yes,
You know.
yes. If we'll still have some time after the break, we can continue with that. But the fact is that communism really didn't die. And if it died, it might have died on, let's say, on the economic level or something like that, because today I think there is no chance that the state would try again to take over the
Well, it was an
economy and
economic
so forth.
failure.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, and there was a complete failure. That's right.
It doesn't work.
Yes, they just those who planned communism as the force of oppression, they understand that they had to change tactics.
Yes.
And they really did. And communism is thriving and is alive, but under a different coat.
Yeah, so that's a provocative thing to say, that communism, the world says that communism is dead, but you're saying that communism is still very much alive, which is under another color,
Yes.
another cover.
Yes, yes,
So, well, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back to talk more about this aspect of communism, the cultural communism,
Yes.
and maybe take some questions from the audience. So we will break, and we will be back in a few minutes.